Hey friend, welcome back to my kitchen. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jen. I do cooking, canning, and food preservation videos every Tuesday, and I do vlogs on Fridays. If that seems like the kind of content that you would be into, I hope you'll consider subscribing and sticking around. Today we're going to be making sun-dried tomatoes. And really they're not sun-dried, this is just a fake out. I have a bunch of ripe tomatoes. This is the last of my tomatoes for the season, and I needed a way to preserve them for future use that didn't involve making sauce. I have plenty of tomatoes for that. So we're going to start off making a seasoning for these tomatoes. We're going to be doing these in the oven. You do not have to have a dehydrator to do this. It's super simple. Even a toaster oven that can go on low temperatures can be used to make these dried tomatoes. Now, you can add whatever you like to this seasoning, but for this particular mix, I'm using 1 teaspoon of dried thyme, a tablespoon of garlic powder, 1½ teaspoons of basil, 5 teaspoons of salt, and 1½ teaspoons of rosemary that's been crushed up. As I said, that's totally up to you what you want to add. If you prefer one thing over the other, if you want to throw some oregano in there, that'd be great too. Make the seasoning mix yours. You're the one that's going to be eating it. And you can totally use fresh herbs for this, but I decided to use dried herbs just because I still have some from last year that I need to use up, last year's garden. So I figured I would just go ahead and use up what I had on hand instead of fresh. And what I have out in the garden, I'll dry for use over the winter this year. So you're just going to crush your rosemary up in there. If it's fresh, you can just chop it up kind of fine. Do the best you can. I actually started off trying to cut this on the cutting board and it went everywhere, so I just resorted to breaking it up with my fingers. I'm going to give this a really good mix to make sure everything's incorporated and even, and then I'm going to set it to the side and we're going to go ahead and get started on these tomatoes. Now, if you wanted to go ahead and double or triple this mixture here, it would totally store really nicely in a jar in your pantry for future use. I might end up doing that myself, actually. It turned out to be really good. So I'm just going to start cutting the tops off of my tomatoes. If you're using Roma tomatoes, this next step here is something that you're not really going to have to do. You won't have to do this with cherry tomatoes either. These are slicer tomatoes, so when I cut these, I'm going to end up having to scrape out the seeds. Roma tomatoes are made for things like sauce and paste, so they aren't as seedy as maybe a slicer tomato is. So if you're using cherry tomatoes, just split them in half. If you're using Roma tomatoes, again, split them in half long ways after you remove the blossom end of it. And then you'll just be able to proceed with the step after this one. But for me, I get to spend a little time squishing out the seeds from these tomatoes. Now, at first I was trying to figure out what the best way to do this would be, but because these are really ripe, I didn't end up having to use my fork to scrape out the seeds. I figured out that if I just pressed my thumb into the little pockets of the tomato, the seeds just came right out, and that way I didn't waste a lot of the flesh of the tomato. You'll see me pulling something off of the tomatoes from time to time, and that's the core. As I said, these are slicer tomatoes, and some of them don't really have much of a core, and some of them do. So the ones that I notice that there's a hard bit at the bottom, I just go ahead and pull that off. But you see, I just press my thumb into it, and the seeds come right out. No big deal. And then I'm going to put this onto a parchment-lined cookie sheet. And I'm going to try to give these tomatoes a little space between each one. I don't want them touching or overlapping. I want the air to be able to move around them so they all get dried pretty evenly. And I'm just going to continue through this process until I am completely done with these tomatoes. Now, if you want to do this with slicer tomatoes like I did, you don't have to cut them into wedges the way I did. I wanted to store these in a pint jar, so I needed them to be a little bit smaller. You could just do this in slices. It might be a little bit more tedious to get the seeds out of slices rather than big wedges, but it would store exactly the same in a jar. It just might take a little bigger of a jar depending on how many tomatoes you're doing. And while I was doing this, I went ahead and I had my oven preheating to 220 degrees. If you're doing this in a dehydrator, you'll want it low, like in the 200s as well. Just a nice low and slow temp. So I'm going to go ahead and drizzle these with just a little bit of olive oil, not a lot, just enough so that the seasoning powder can stick to them. The olive oil isn't going to make much of a difference because when I'm done, I'm storing these in olive oil. If you didn't want to store them in olive oil, you could just freeze them, or you could just put them in a jar in the refrigerator and use them up pretty quickly. I decided to store these in olive oil because I wanted them to kind of plump back up, because my goal is to use them to make sun-dried tomato focaccia bread. And the olive oil soaking back into the tomatoes is going to make them absolutely delicious. So you'll see that I'm seasoning pretty heavy. I don't mind that at all. You don't have to season these one bit if you don't want to. But because I'm storing them in the olive oil that's also going to go on the focaccia bread, I want some of the seasoning to impart flavor into the oil itself. So just go as heavy-handed as you want with the seasoning. It doesn't matter. I'm going to put both of these pans into my oven at 225 degrees, and I'm going to check on it after about 2 hours, make sure nothing's burning, make sure nothing's sticking. And altogether, it took about 4.5 to 5 hours to get them to the texture that I wanted. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and store the rest of the seasoning powder that I made in an old jar in my spice cabinet, and I will use this to process some cherry tomatoes soon in exactly the same way. We do not waste seasoning around this house. That is a cardinal sin. So after about 4.5 to 5 hours, this is what my tomatoes look like. You'll see they're kind of leathery. Now, in some spots where the skin was thinner, it is quite crispy. But as soon as I put them into the jar with the olive oil, that started to rehydrate, so I wasn't really worried about the texture of those being too dry. So what I'm going to do is put them into a clean mason jar. This is a pint-sized jar. I just shook the whole piece of parchment paper in there so that any leftover herbs or seasonings that were on the parchment went into the jar as well. And as I said before, that's just going to help to season the olive oil, and it's going to make it delicious. I really can't wait to make this focaccia bread because I think these tomatoes are just going to put it right over the top. But yeah, this is just a really great way to use up a surplus of tomatoes you might have from the garden. Don't forget to drop half of them on the counter. Make sure your counters are clean so you can just pop them right back in the jar. But I have so many pounds of tomatoes, probably 50 pounds of tomatoes in my freezer right now, waiting to be processed into sauce. And so I just wanted to do something a little different that would not only preserve these delicious tomatoes that I grew this year, but also, give me options as to, how to use them. You could use these to make pasta sauce. This would be delicious with just, like a cream pasta, and then you chop up a few of these sun-dried tomatoes and throw in there with it. Oh, that would be so good. So I'm just going to use my wooden chopstick to push these around a little bit and make sure there's no big air pockets in there. I want everybody to be sitting in that olive oil. And then I'm going to put a lid on it, and it's going right into my refrigerator, and it will keep there for a couple of months, easy. I really don't think they're going to last that long before they get eaten, but they could if you needed them to. And you can see here that the olive oil has already started to take on the beautiful color of those tomatoes. So I really hope that you give this a try, even if you just have a few cherry tomatoes to use up. Pop them in the oven, low and slow. It makes them so sweet and delicious. So until next time, friends, happy cooking.